Hey guys, this video is for educational purposes only. Please do not break the law.
So I guess let's talk about like what the most popular growing medias are for like a commercial user versus like a home hobbyist user, right? Because I probably gonna be quite different when it comes to the bulkiness, the amount of shipping, you know, all this different stuff. So yeah, what's kind of like the difference? How would someone approach it?
Okay, so first of all, let's be specific about indoor versus outdoor because that makes a huge world of difference. Outdoor, a lot of people are growing in the dirt. They're amending their soil with soil or with other amendments. They're generally not going to be using rock wool if they're growing trees outdoor, right? And so there's less variety of what people are using outdoors. Indoors, which is what mostly we'll focus on today. Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches. I would say right now, the most popular thing that people are growing in is probably going to be cocoa and cocoa mixes. So this would be Coco Coir. When they make Coco Coir, they grind it into a fine, very like fluffy, fine powder. It's called peat. But nowadays, people are using Coco Coir, and it'll have the cocoa peat. Sometimes they mix in some of the cocoa fibers in there, which gives it some other structure and helps with the drainage. They'll also mix perlite in there. That really lightens up the growing media. And that's used in a lot of different mixes. But back to what specifically you asked. So Coco Coir mixed with some perlite to keep it light. And it is probably the most cost effective and best for quality that people are using right now. It's cheaper than rock wool. And, I'll talk about rock wool in a second. That used to be what most folks were using for CEA, for indoor grows. It's less expensive. It's organic. A lot of people feel like they're getting better flavor off of it. And terpenes, And if you're mixing it with perlite, it has a better drainage. If you don't use perlite, it can be a little bit heavy and hold a little bit too much moisture for some folks. And now, recently, and this is another reason why it's become so popular, is that a lot of different manufacturers now put this into prepackaged, half gallon, 1 gallon, 2 gallon bags, right? And these can be either loose, so it's just the loose peat ready to go, or it's compressed and dehydrated. And there's different reasons why you might want to use one or the other, but those are definitely one of the more popular items right now.
You mentioned loose versus compressed and dehydrated. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the benefits of the compressed dehydrated blocks is that they're smaller and they're lighter because there's very little moisture in there. So your transportation costs are going to be a lot lower than if you bought the same sort of like 1 gallon cocoa pot is what they're called. If it was loose, you're going to have more bulk when you're transporting, more moisture. It's going to be heavier, bigger, more cost to transport. The other thing is that when you get it to your facility, you've got to store it. So if you have the compressed dehydrated blocks, you can fit a lot more in the same square footage or cubic footage when you're storing it. Whereas the loose fill are going to take up a lot more room. So that's kind of the advantages of the compressed and dehydrated. But a lot of people are actually getting away from that because what they're noticing is that extra step of rehydrating the compressed dehydrated blocks, it takes, again, more labor. It's variable. And if these dehydrated compressed cocoa blocks are sitting for a while at the manufacturer's warehouse, they can dry out to a point that they're very difficult to rehydrate. They have uneven hydration. So you might get channeling where the water will only go into like a half of the block or a quarter of the block and you get dry spots. And that's no good because when you're doing your irrigation later and you have all your plants in there, some of those blocks are going to require more irrigation than others because you have this variability. So you really want to avoid that. I've also run into issues with certain suppliers, certain manufacturers of cocoa blocks where, it's really important for cocoa to be flushed. Okay. And those dehydrated blocks, sometimes they aren't flushed as well as others. Like you want to make sure you get a good brand that's very consistent because if they're not flushed properly, they can kill your plants. And that's true with any cocoa product. Now, the loose fill, they're fantastic. They do take more cost for transportation and storage, more room. But when you get them, you just literally open them up and you pop the plant in and you can immediately begin irrigating. You might want to flush them just to make sure that they're clean, but they're essentially ready to go. And that's why they're so popular right now.
Okay, so some of this like the compressed and dehydrated stuff, when it arrives, it is potentially not flushed very well. Why exactly is it such a big deal to make sure that it's flushed well?
Yeah, so really this applies to any cocoa products, but I've seen it more of an issue with the compressed dehydrated blocks. So cocoa has a really high CEC, that's that cation exchange capacity I mentioned earlier. And so that means it holds on to the positively charged ions, positively charged nutrients. Well, coconut trees, they're grown where? Near the ocean typically, right? So they can be loaded up with sodium and potassium ions. And if you don't flush those out, then those can come out when you're feeding it and they can really change your nutrient profile. And obviously, you don't want a lot of sodium in your nutrients. So any cocoa product needs to be flushed very heavily, typically like with CalMag or something like that, so you can replace the sodium potassium with something like magnesium and calcium that is much more easily dealt with when it comes to feeding your plants. It doesn't cause any issues there.